Welcome to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean, and here every whisper hides a mystery. These Miss Marple stories are my own creations, written just for you. So lean in and let the clues begin. In the shadowy halls of Stonygates, a reform home for delinquent boys, Miss Jane Marple unravels a chilling murder disguised as a locked-room mystery. When a gunshot pierces a chaotic theatrical performance, trustee Christian Gulbrandsen is found dead, a wiped revolver and a burned letter hinting at embezzlement. As secrets unravel, Marple's keen eye reveals a cunning plot. Louis Saracold, the Institute's fervent leader, orchestrates a deadly distraction, using his stepson Alex's theatrical flair to silence a financial scandal. With mirrors, misdirection, and hidden motives, Marple exposes the truth in a gripping tale of betrayal and deception. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Invitation. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where she sat, her knitting needles moving with the quiet rhythm of habit. The click-clack of the needles was the only sound in the room, save for the occasional chirp of a sparrow outside. Her hands, though aged, were nimble, weaving soft wool into a scarf for a distant nephew. She paused, her pale blue eyes drifting to the window, where the village lay in its usual drowsy peace. It was a day like any other, yet Miss Marple felt a faint stir of anticipation, as if the air held a whisper of something unexpected. The postman's bicycle bell jingled faintly down the lane, and soon a letter slid through the slot, landing with a soft thud on the mat. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose, her movements unhurried but purposeful. The envelope bore elegant, looping handwriting, unmistakably that of Carrie Louise Saracold, an old-school friend from a time when they were both young girls, giggling over French verbs and pressed flowers. The sight of it brought a smile to Miss Marple's lips, tinged with curiosity. Carrie Louise, always so gentle, so trusting, had a way of drawing people into her orbit, and her letters were rare treasures. Seated once more, Miss Marple opened the letter with a silver paper knife, her fingers careful not to tear the delicate stationery. The words flowed in Carrie Louise's familiar style, warm yet tinged with a curious hesitancy. "My dearest Jane," it began, "it has been too long since we last met, and I find myself longing for your company. Would you consider a visit to Stonygates? It is a strange place now, full of young men learning to mend their ways. But I sense an unease here that I cannot quite name. Your sharp eyes and kind heart would do us good." The letter went on to describe the estate, now a reform home for delinquent boys, run by her husband, Louis Saracold. It ended with a plea. "Do come, Jane. I feel you might see what I cannot." Miss Marple folded the letter thoughtfully, her mind turning over the words. Unease. A vague word, but from Carrie Louise it carried weight. She recalled her friend's gentle nature, her unshakable belief in the goodness of others, a trait that had often left her vulnerable. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing the small dramas of village life, sensed a puzzle beneath the invitation. She resolved to go, her curiosity now a steady flame. 2 days later, Miss Marple stepped off the train at Market Kindle, her modest suitcase in hand. The station was small, its platform lined with late summer flowers, and a chauffeured car awaited her, sent by Carrie Louise. The driver, a taciturn man with a weathered face, said little as they wound through country lanes toward Stonygates. The estate came into view abruptly, a sprawling Victorian mansion of red brick and pointed gables, its grandeur marred by peeling paint and overgrown ivy. Beyond the house stretched a patchwork of fields and outbuildings, where young men in rough work clothes moved with purpose, overseen by stern-faced instructors. Carrie Louise greeted her at the door, her frail figure wrapped in a shawl despite the warm day. Her face, lined with age, lit up with a smile that erased the years. "Jane, you darling," she exclaimed, embracing her friend. "You haven't changed a bit." Miss Marple, in her neat tweed skirt and sensible shoes, returned the smile, noting the faint tremor in Carrie Louise's hands. They moved to the drawing room, where tea was laid out on a silver tray, the china delicate but chipped. Over tea, Miss Marple met the household. Louis Sericold, Carrie Louise's husband, was a tall man with a scholar's stoop and intense gray eyes. His handshake was firm, his manner earnest as he spoke of his mission to reform wayward youths. "We give them purpose, Miss Marple," he said, his voice fervent. "A chance to rebuild." Yet his eyes darted to Carrie Louise, as if seeking her approval, and Miss Marple wondered at his intensity. Carrie Louise's daughter, Mildred Street, joined them, her lips pursed in disapproval. A widow in severe black, she spoke little, her gaze flicking to the reform boys visible through the window with a mix of disdain and fear. "They're not to be trusted," she murmured, stirring her tea. Miss Marple noted the tension in her posture, the resentment that seemed to simmer beneath her prim exterior. Gina Hudd, Carrie Louise's granddaughter, burst into the room like a gust of fresh air. Young and striking, with dark curls and a radiant smile, she kissed her grandmother's cheek before turning to Miss Marple. "You must be Aunt Jane. Grandmama's told me all about you." Her husband, Walter Hudd, an American with a brooding air, followed reluctantly. His handshake was curt, his eyes shadowed, and Miss Marple sensed a restlessness in him, a man out of place. The final introduction was to Christian Gulbrandsen, a trustee of the Reform Institute, a man of imposing presence with a clipped Norwegian accent. His stern face softened only when addressing Carrie Louise, but his eyes held a guarded quality, as if he carried a secret. "I am here on business," he said brusquely, excusing himself to write letters. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloging the household's dynamics, loyalty, resentment, secrecy, all swirling beneath the surface. As evening fell, the group gathered for dinner, the long table set with faded elegance. The conversation turned to the reform boys, and Louis spoke passionately of their progress. Yet Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a young delinquent, Ernie Gregg, who served at the table, his sly grin and quick fingers suggesting a nature not entirely reformed. She caught Louis watching him too, not with disapproval, but with a curious intensity, as if Ernie were a piece in a larger game. Later, as Miss Marple retired to her room, she paused at the window, gazing at the dark silhouette of Stonygates against the moonlit sky. The house felt alive with secrets, its corridors whispering of hidden motives. She thought of Carrie Louise's letter, the word unease lingering like a shadow. Settling into her armchair, her knitting in her lap, Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Whatever lay beneath the surface of Stonygates, she would find it, as she always did, by watching, listening, and seeing what others overlooked. Chapter 2. The uneasy household. The morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds over Stonygates, casting a muted glow across the sprawling estate. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her bedroom window, observed the reform boys trudging toward the fields, their boots sinking into the damp earth. The air held a chill, and she adjusted her shawl, her knitting needles resting idle in her lap. The house, with its creaking floors and faded grandeur, seemed to hum with an undercurrent of tension, as if it too sensed the unease Carrie Louise had hinted at in her letter. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp despite her age, scanned the scene below, noting the purposeful stride of the instructors and the reluctant slouch of the boys. Something, she thought, was amiss here, though it hid behind the facade of routine. She descended to the breakfast room where the household was assembling. The long mahogany table, polished but scarred with age, bore a modest spread: toast, marmalade, and a pot of tea that steamed faintly in the cool air. Carrie Louise presided with her usual grace, her delicate hands pouring tea as she smiled at each arrival. Yet Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes darted toward the door as if expecting an unwelcome guest. Louis Saracold, already seated, was engrossed in a ledger, his pen scratching notes with a fervor that suggested more than administrative zeal. He glanced up as Miss Marple entered, offering a courteous nod, but his eyes held a guarded intensity that piqued her curiosity. Mildred Strate, in her severe black dress, sat rigidly at the table's far end, her lips pursed as she buttered her toast with precise, economical movements. Her disapproval of the reform boys was palpable, and when one, a lanky youth with a scar above his brow, entered to clear plates, she flinched visibly. "They're everywhere," she muttered, low enough that only Miss Marple, seated nearby, caught the words. Mildred's resentment, Miss Marple mused, seemed to extend beyond the boys to the very purpose of Stonygates. Was it jealousy of her mother's attention, or something deeper? Gina Hudd swept in, her vibrant energy a stark contrast to the room's somber mood. Her dark curls bounced as she kissed Carrie Louise's cheek, her laughter bright but edged with a restless quality. "Good morning, Aunt Jane," she called, settling beside Miss Marple with a grin. "Did you sleep well in this drafty old pile?" Walter Hudd, her husband, followed, his broad shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible burden. He nodded curtly to Miss Marple, his dark eyes avoiding hers, and took a seat opposite Gina, his silence heavy. Miss Marple noted the way Gina's hand brushed Walter's arm, a gesture meant to soothe but met with a slight withdrawal. Trouble there, she thought, filing the observation away. Christian Gulbrandsen, the Norwegian trustee, was the last to arrive, his stern face softened only by a brief smile for Carrie Louise. He declined breakfast, citing urgent correspondence, and excused himself with a formal bow. His departure left a faint ripple of tension, and Miss Marple wondered what business brought him to Stonygates so abruptly. Louis's eyes followed Christian's exit, his pen pausing mid-stroke, and Miss Marple sensed a silent communication, a shared secret perhaps, that neither man wished to voice. As breakfast concluded, Carrie Louise invited Miss Marple for a walk through the grounds. The two women strolled arm in arm, the gravel path crunching beneath their feet. The estate was a curious blend of neglect and purpose. Rose beds choked with weeds flanked neatly tilled fields where the reform boys worked under watchful eyes. Carrie Louise spoke fondly of the Institute, her voice warm with belief in Louis's mission. "He sees potential in every boy," she said, gesturing toward a group hauling sacks of grain. "Even the worst of them, he thinks, can be saved." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the worst of them. Ernie Gregg, the sly youth from dinner, whose quick fingers and insolent grin suggested a nature not easily tamed. They paused by a low stone wall, and Carrie Louise's expression grew pensive. "Jane," she said softly, "I sometimes wonder if I've been too trusting. There's a shadow here, though I can't see its shape." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand, her own thoughts racing. Trust, she knew, could blind one to danger, and Carrie Louise's gentle heart was a beacon for those who might exploit it. "Tell me about the household," Miss Marple prompted, her tone mild but her eyes keen. Carrie Louise spoke of Mildred's bitterness, rooted in a childhood overshadowed by her mother's many marriages. "She feels I've given too much to others," Carrie Louise admitted, her voice tinged with guilt. "Of Gina and Walter," she said, "Gina's so full of life, but Walter struggles here. He's not used to our ways. Louis she described as devoted, almost obsessively so, to the reform work. Though lately he seemed distracted, his nights spent poring over accounts. Christian's visit, she added, was unexpected, tied to some concern about the Institute's funding. He's always been so loyal, she said, but her voice faltered, and Miss Marple sensed an unspoken fear. Their walk led them past the outbuildings, where Miss Marple caught sight of Ernie Gregg lounging against a shed, his eyes following them with a calculating gleam. She recalled his performance at dinner, the way he'd spun tales of petty theft with a performer's flair, and wondered how much was bravado and how much a mask for something darker. Louis, passing by, called Ernie to task, his tone firm but oddly indulgent, as if he saw in the boy a challenge worth meeting. Miss Marple's instincts stirred. There was a dynamic here, a subtle interplay she couldn't yet define. Back at the house, Miss Marple joined the family in the drawing room, where Alex Restorick, Carrie Louise's stepson, held court. A theatrical director with a penchant for dramatic gestures, Alex was describing a rehabilitation exercise he'd planned for the boys, an improvised performance to build their confidence. His blonde hair gleamed under the chandelier, and his voice carried a practiced charm. But Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked to Louis, seeking approval or perhaps gauging suspicion. Gina clapped delightedly at the idea, while Walter muttered something about play-acting nonsense and left the room. Mildred, knitting her own grim square, remarked that such theatrics were a waste of time. "The boys need discipline, not indulgence," she said sharply. As the conversation drifted, Miss Marple slipped upstairs, her curiosity drawing her to the corridor outside Christian Gulbrandson's room. The house was quiet, save for the distant clatter of the kitchen. She paused, her hand resting lightly on the banister, when a low murmur reached her ears. It came from the study below, where Christian and Louis were speaking, their voices muffled but urgent. "It cannot be ignored any longer," Christian said, his tone clipped. "The figures don't add up." Louis's reply was softer, almost pleading, but the words were lost to the thick walls. Miss Marple's knitting, tucked in her bag, was forgotten as she leaned closer, her heart quickening. An argument over money, perhaps? Or something more sinister? She retreated to her room, her mind alight with possibilities. The study, she recalled, was adjacent to the drawing room, its heavy oak door often locked. Whatever Christian and Louis discussed, it was not meant for others' ears. She thought of Carrie Louise's unease, of Louis's guarded demeanor, of Alex's theatrical flair. Each person in this house, she realized, played a role, but whose performance hid the truth? That evening, dinner was a strained affair. The dining room, with its faded tapestries and tarnished candelabra, felt oppressive under the weight of unspoken tensions. Ernie Gregg served again, his movements deft but his eyes darting, as if anticipating trouble. Alex, animated, recounted a recent production in London, his hands weaving stories in the air. Gina laughed, but Walter's scowl deepened, and he excused himself abruptly, claiming a headache. Mildred, picking at her food, muttered about the boys' presence at table, her voice a low hiss. Christian, silent through most of the meal, retired early, mentioning a letter he must finish. Louis watched him go, his face unreadable. Miss Marple, seated beside Carrie Louise, kept her observations subtle, her questions gentle. She asked about the reform boys' routines, learning that they were free to roam the grounds during certain hours, a fact that seemed to unsettle Mildred further. "They could be anywhere," she said, her fork clattering against her plate. Miss Marple noted Ernie's smirk as he cleared the dishes, his fingers brushing the silver with a familiarity that suggested more than casual interest. After dinner, the household dispersed, and Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, her knitting resumed as a pretext for observation. Gina and Alex remained, their banter light but tinged with an edge. Gina's flirtation was playful, yet Alex's responses carried a calculated charm. Miss Marple wondered if their familiarity masked something deeper, perhaps a shared secret. Walter's absence, too, was telling. His discomfort in this house was palpable, but was it born of resentment or guilt? As the clock struck 9, Miss Marple retired, her mind a whirl of impressions. She paused at her window, gazing at the dark expanse of Stonygates. The reform boys' dormitory lights flickered in the distance, and she thought of Ernie, his sly grin a mirror to the house's hidden currents. Carrie Louise's letter had spoken of unease, and now Miss Marple felt it too, a sense that the stage was set for something darker than a mere performance. She settled into her armchair, her needles clicking softly, and resolved to watch closely. In a house like Stonygates, where every smile and gesture seemed rehearsed, the truth would reveal itself not in grand gestures, but in the smallest slips, the fleeting glances that betrayed the heart. Chapter 3. The Staged Commotion. The evening at Stonygates was heavy with the scent of damp wood and wax polish, the drawing room's high ceilings and faded tapestries lending an air of solemnity to the gathering. Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner near a tarnished brass lamp, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, almost hypnotic rhythm. The soft click-clack, a counterpoint to the low murmur of voices. The room had been rearranged for Alex Restorick's theatrical rehabilitation exercise, a performance designed, he claimed, to build confidence in the reform boys. A makeshift stage, cobbled together from crates and draped with a frayed velvet curtain, stood at one end, its edges illuminated by flickering oil lamps. Miss Marple, her pale blue eyes half hidden behind her spectacles, watched the preparations with a quiet intensity, sensing that the evening's drama might extend beyond the scripted lines. Carrie Louise Saracold, frail but radiant in a lavender shawl, sat nearby, her hands clasped in her lap as she smiled at the bustling activity. Her trust in Alex's scheme was evident, but Miss Marple noted the faint lines of worry creasing her friend's brow, a silent echo of the unease mentioned in her letter. Louis Saracold, his ledger abandoned for the moment, stood near the stage, his gray eyes fixed on the boys with a scrutiny that seemed to weigh their every move. Gina Hudd, vibrant in a crimson dress, lounged on a sofa, her laughter bright but tinged with a restless edge. Her husband, Walter Hudd, leaned against a bookcase, his brooding presence casting a shadow over her gaiety. Mildred Strata, in her usual black, sat stiffly in a high-backed chair, her knitting needles stabbing the wool with a ferocity that betrayed her disapproval. Christian Gulbrandsen, the stern trustee, had retired to the study to work on his correspondence, his absence noted by Lewis's occasional glances toward the heavy oak door. Alex Restorick, the architect of the evening's entertainment, moved with the confidence of a born showman. His blonde hair caught the lamplight as he directed the reform boys, his voice carrying a practiced charm. "You're not just playing a part, lads," he said, clapping a boy on the shoulder. "You're telling a story. Make us believe it." The boys, a ragtag group in patched jackets and scuffed boots, responded with a mix of bravado and uncertainty. Ernie Gregg, the sly youth Miss Marple had marked at dinner, stood out, his sharp grin and quick movements suggesting a natural flair for performance. He was to play the ringleader in a melodrama about a gang of thieves, and his exaggerated snarls drew chuckles from Gina, though Walter's scowl deepened. Miss Marple, her knitting a pretext for observation, noted the dynamics at play. Alex's charm was infectious, but there was a calculation in his eyes, a flicker of something that suggested he was directing more than just the boys. Lewis's intensity, too, was striking. He watched Ernie with a focus that seemed to go beyond reform, as if the boy were a piece in a larger puzzle. Gina's flirtation with Alex, light but persistent, drew a tightening of Walter's jaw, and Miss Marple wondered if jealousy might be a motive in this house of secrets. Mildred's muttered complaints about the boy's presence, a danger to us all, carried a venom that hinted at deeper resentments. The stage, Miss Marple thought, was set for something more than a mere exercise. As the clock chimed 8, Alex signaled the start of the performance. The lamps were dimmed, casting long shadows across the room, and the boys took their places. The play was a chaotic affair, its plot a loose framework of theft and betrayal, punctuated by shouted lines and clattering props. Ernie, as the villainous leader, strutted across the stage, his voice booming as he orchestrated a mock robbery. The other boys, less assured, stumbled over their lines, their wooden sticks and tin cups banging loudly as they mimicked a brawl. The household watched, Carrie Louise with gentle encouragement, Gina with delight, and Mildred with barely concealed disdain. Walter, his arms crossed, stared out the window, his thoughts unreadable. Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn to the mechanics of the performance. The chaos was carefully timed, the noise swelling at precise intervals under Alex's direction. She noted the way the stage was positioned, its edge close to the study door, and how the lamps cast shadows that obscured the corners of the room. Her mind, trained by years of unraveling village intrigues, sensed a pattern, a choreography that went beyond the boys' clumsy acting. Ernie's exaggerated gestures, she thought, were almost too perfect, as if designed to hold every eye. The performance reached its climax, with Ernie and a wiry boy named Tommy staging a heated argument. Their shouts filled the room, furniture was overturned with theatrical zeal, and the clatter of props created a cacophony. Suddenly, a sharp crack pierced the din. A gunshot, unmistakable and chilling, from the direction of the study. The room fell silent, the boys freezing mid-motion, their props clattering to the floor. Gina's hand flew to her mouth, and Walter spun toward the sound, his hand instinctively reaching for his belt. Mildred's knitting slipped from her lap, her face ashen. Carrie Louise clutched the arm of her chair, her breath catching. Louis Saracold was the first to move, his face pale but composed as he strode toward the study. "Stay where you are," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. Alex followed, his charm replaced by a sudden intensity, gesturing for the boys to remain. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as ever, slipped her knitting into her bag and rose, her steps slow but purposeful, as she trailed behind. The study door was ajar, and as Louis pushed it open, a low cry escaped him. Christian Gulbranson lay slumped over the desk, a revolver beside his hand, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The room was locked from the inside, the heavy bolt in place, and the single window was shut, its latch undisturbed. A half-finished letter lay under Christian's hand, its ink smudged, the words unreadable from the doorway. "He's dead," Louis said, his voice hollow. "Shot through the heart." Carrie Louise, who had followed despite his command, swayed, and Gina rushed to her side, her face pale, but her eyes sharp. Alex, peering over Louis's shoulder, murmured something about a suicide, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple, lingering just outside, took in the scene with a clarity that belied her gentle appearance. The revolver, wiped clean of prints, gleamed under the lamplight. The letter, she suspected, was the key, but it was either incomplete or missing. The locked room, the precise timing of the shot. It was all too neat, too staged, like the performance itself. Inspector Curry arrived within the hour, his lean frame and sharp eyes cutting through the household's shock. A methodical man with a notebook always at the ready, he surveyed the study with a practiced gaze, his questions brisk but precise. Louis admitted to speaking with Christian earlier that evening, a discussion about funding for the institute, he claimed, that had ended amicably. "We had no quarrel," he said, though his hands clenched briefly, betraying a tension Miss Marple noted. Alex, still shaken, insisted he was directing the boys when the shot rang out, his alibi supported by the chaos of the performance. Gina and Walter, who had slipped outside to the garden during the play, heard the shot but saw no one near the study. "It was dark," Gina said, her voice steady, but her eyes flickering toward Walter, who nodded curtly. Mildred, in her room upstairs, claimed to have been reading, her tone sharp with disdain for the evening's nonsense. Ernie Gregg, questioned briefly, grinned and swore he was just acting, his eyes glinting with a defiance that Miss Marple found unsettling. As the inspector worked, Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, her mind sifting through the evening's events. The gunshot had coincided perfectly with the peak of the performance's chaos, a moment when every eye was on the stage. She recalled the scuff mark she had noticed near the study door, a smudge of dirt that suggested hurried movement. The mirror above the study fireplace came to mind, its angle reflecting the desk in a way that could mislead the eye. Was it possible, she wondered, that the shot had been fired elsewhere, the sound masked by the commotion? Her thoughts turned to Alex, whose theatrical expertise could orchestrate such a deception, and to Louis, whose calm in the face of tragedy seemed almost rehearsed. Carrie Louise, pale and trembling, approached Miss Marple, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jane, how could this happen? Christian was so dear to us, so trusted." Miss Marple patted her hand, her tone soothing, but her mind racing. "We shall find out, my dear," she said. "The truth has a way of revealing itself, even in the darkest corners." As she spoke, her eyes drifted to the stage, where the velvet curtain lay crumpled, its folds hiding the scuff mark she had seen. She thought of Ernie's sly grin, of Alex's calculated charm, of Lewis's guarded intensity. The performance, she realized, was far from over, and the real drama was only beginning. Later that night, as the household dispersed to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, her knitting resumed as a pretext for reflection. The lamps had been extinguished, leaving only the glow of the fire to illuminate the space. She rose, her steps soft on the worn carpet, and approached the stage. Kneeling carefully, she examined the scuff mark again, noting its proximity to the study door. It was fresh, the dirt still damp, suggesting it had been made that evening. She straightened, her mind turning to the boy's performance, the way Ernie had dominated the stage, drawing every eye. Had he been a distraction or something more? She moved to the study door, now sealed by Inspector Curry's orders, and paused, her hand resting lightly on the frame. The lock, she knew, was sturdy, the bolt heavy. Yet the shot had been so perfectly timed, so seamlessly woven into the chaos, that she could not shake the sense of a carefully planned illusion. She thought of the village pageants in St. Mary Mead, where a well-timed distraction could hide a multitude of sins. Here, at Stonygates, the stakes were higher, the players more cunning. As she returned to her seat, Miss Marple's eyes fell on a discarded prop, a tin cup, dented and unremarkable, lying near the stage. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was heavier than it looked, its base scratched as if dragged across a hard surface. A fleeting memory stirred of a village boy who had used a similar trick to smuggle sweets during a church fete. She set the cup down, her mind alight with possibilities. The shot, the locked room, the missing letter. All were pieces of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. The clock struck 10, its chimes echoing through the silent house. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and made her way upstairs, her steps slow, but her thoughts racing. Stonygates, with its secrets and shadows, was a stage where every player had a role. Alex, with his theatrical flair, Lewis, with his intense devotion, Ernie, with his sly cunning, each could be part of the deception. And then there was Carrie Louise, whose gentle trust might have blinded her to the danger in her own home. As Miss Marple reached her room, she paused at the window, gazing at the dark expanse of the estate. The truth, she knew, lay hidden in the details, the scuff mark, the mirror, the cup, and she would find it, as she always did, by watching, listening, and seeing what others overlooked. Chapter 4. The Suspects Assemble. The morning after Christian Gulbranson's death dawned gray and heavy. The clouds over Stonygates mirroring the somber mood within the house. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing room, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her pale blue eyes were sharp, scanning the faces of the household as they gathered at Inspector Curry's request. The air was thick with unspoken questions, the weight of tragedy pressing down on the faded grandeur of the room. The makeshift stage from the previous night's performance had been dismantled, but its presence lingered in the scuff marks on the floor and the faint scent of lamp oil. Miss Marple, unobtrusive in her corner, felt the tension coiling beneath the surface like a spring waiting to snap. Inspector Curry stood by the fireplace, his lean frame commanding attention without effort. His notebook, ever present, lay open on a side table, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. He was a man of method, his sharp eyes missing nothing as he surveyed the assembled group. Carrie Louise, frail and pale, her hands clasped tightly. Louis Sericold, his face drawn but composed. Gina Hudd, her vibrancy subdued but her eyes alert. Walter Hudd, brooding and silent, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Mildred Strete, rigid in her black dress, her lips a thin line. And Alex Restorick, his theatrical charm dimmed, but his posture still poised, as if ready for a cue. The reform boys, including Ernie Gregg, were absent, confined to their dormitory under the supervision of the Institute's staff, but their presence loomed in the questions that hung unspoken. "Ladies and gentlemen," Inspector Curry began, his voice calm but authoritative, "we are dealing with a murder. Christian Gulbrandsen was shot dead last night in a locked study, with no apparent means of entry or exit. I need your accounts of the evening to piece together what happened." His gaze swept the room, lingering on each face, and Miss Marple noted the slight shifts in posture, the fleeting glances that betrayed unease. She adjusted her shawl, her needles clicking softly, a picture of harmless gentility, but her mind was a whirl of observation, cataloging every detail. Louis Sericold was the first to speak, his voice steady, but his hands betraying a slight tremor as he clasped them behind his back. "Christian and I spoke in the study before the performance," he said. "It was about institute funding, routine matters, though he had some concerns about the accounts. We parted on good terms." He hesitated, his gray eyes flickering toward Carrie Louise, as if seeking her reassurance. Inspector Curry nodded, jotting a note. "And after that?" he asked. Louis explained he had joined the household in the drawing room, overseeing the boys' performance until the gunshot interrupted. "I was near the stage, with Alex," he added, his tone measured. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. Louis's account was plausible, but his hesitation suggested something withheld. She recalled the muffled argument she had overheard the previous night, Christian's firm insistence that it must be addressed. Was it truly routine, or had Christian uncovered something Louis wished to conceal? Alex Restorick spoke next, his voice smooth, but lacking its usual flair. "I was directing the boys' performance," he said, brushing a lock of blonde hair from his forehead. "The whole thing was choreographed chaos, shouts, props, movement. I was in the thick of it when the shot rang out." He spread his hands as if to emphasize his openness, but Miss Marple noted the quick glance he cast toward Louis, a silent communication that piqued her curiosity. Alex's theatrical expertise, she thought, could orchestrate more than a play. It could mask a crime. Gina Hudd, her crimson dress replaced by a subdued gray frock, spoke with a clarity that belied her youth. "Walter and I were in the garden," she said, her voice steady but her fingers twisting a handkerchief. "We needed some air. The performance was so loud. We heard the shot but saw no one near the study. It was too dark." Walter nodded, his dark eyes fixed on the floor. "That's right," he muttered, his American accent clipped. "We came back inside right after." Miss Marple observed the tension between them, Gina's quick glance at Walter, his curt response. Was their absence from the drawing room mere chance or something more calculated? Mildred Strate, her knitting abandoned for once, spoke with a sharpness that cut through the room. "I was in my room, reading," she said, her voice laced with disdain. "I had no interest in that foolish performance. I heard the shot, of course, but I stayed where I was until Lewis called us down." Her eyes flicked to the reform boys' dormitory, visible through the window, her expression one of barely concealed contempt. Miss Marple wondered if Mildred's isolation was genuine, or if her resentment of the Institute and its occupants hid a deeper motive. Inspector Curry turned his attention to the reform boys, though none were present. "I'll be speaking to them individually," he said, "but if anyone saw anything unusual, now's the time to speak." The room remained silent, the household exchanging glances that ranged from wary to defiant. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, thought of Ernie Gregg, his sly grin and quick fingers. Had he been more than a performer in Alex's play? As the inspector concluded his initial questions, he outlined the facts. Christian Gulbrandsen had been shot through the heart with a revolver found on the desk, wiped clean of fingerprints. The study was locked from the inside, the bolt secure, and the window latched. A half-finished letter lay under Christian's hand, its contents illegible due to smudged ink. "The letter is missing its second page," Curry noted, his eyes narrowing. "Either it was never written, or someone took it." The household stirred, a ripple of unease passing through them, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the study's fireplace, where she suspected papers might have been burned. With the formal questioning paused, the household dispersed, though the air remained heavy with suspicion. Miss Marple, excused as a mere guest, lingered in the drawing room, her eyes drawn to the scuff mark near the study door she had noticed the previous night. She approached it, kneeling carefully to examine the faint smudge of dirt. It was still damp, suggesting recent movement, and its proximity to the study suggested a hurried exit, or entry. She straightened, her thoughts racing. The locked room, the wiped revolver, the missing letter, it was all too perfect, a puzzle designed to mislead. Carrie Louise, pale and trembling, approached Miss Marple, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jane, this is dreadful. Christian was like family. Who could do such a thing?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her tone soothing, but her mind alert. "We shall find out, my dear," she said. "The truth is like a thread in a tangle. It takes patience to pull it free." As she spoke, her eyes drifted to the mirror above the fireplace, its angle reflecting the room in a way that could hide movement. She recalled Alex's performance, the way the chaos had drawn every eye, and wondered if the shot had been a carefully timed illusion. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple sought out the reform boys' dormitory later that morning, her steps slow but purposeful, as she crossed the damp lawn. The boys were at work in the fields, but she found Stephen, a quiet lad with a thoughtful air, polishing tools in a shed. She engaged him with her usual disarming charm, asking about the Institute's routines. Stephen, hesitant at first, warmed to her gentle questions. "Ernie's always sneaking about," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Says he's borrowing things from the house, pens, paper, that sort. He was in the study a lot before last night." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her mind. Ernie's pilfering, she thought, might have placed him in the study at a critical moment. Returning to the house, Miss Marple paused in the hall, her eyes drawn to the study door, now sealed with police tape. She thought of the revolver, its clean surface a deliberate erasure of evidence. The locked room suggested an impossible crime, but Miss Marple, with her village-bred skepticism, knew that impossibilities often hid simple truths. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead burglary, where a locked door had been a ruse to mislead the constable. Here the stage was larger, the players more cunning, but the principle was the same. Lunch was a strained affair, the dining room's long table set with mismatched china. Gina, attempting to lighten the mood, spoke of plans to redecorate the institute, but her words fell flat. Walter, silent, pushed his food around his plate, his eyes avoiding hers. Mildred, picking at her meal, muttered about the dangers of the reform boys, her voice sharp with accusation. "One of them did it," she said, glancing at Louis. "You let them run wild." Louis, his face tightening, defended the boys, insisting they were under strict supervision. Alex, unusually subdued, changed the subject to a London production, but his charm seemed forced, his eyes darting to the study door. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, observed the interplay. Louis's defense of the boys was fervent, but his hands betrayed a nervous energy, twisting a napkin as he spoke. Alex's forced gaiety suggested a man playing a part, perhaps to deflect suspicion. Gina's brightness, too, seemed a mask, her glances at Walter tinged with worry. Walter's silence, Miss Marple thought, could be resentment or guilt. And Mildred, with her bitter accusations, might be deflecting attention from her own secrets. As the meal ended, Miss Marple excused herself, claiming a need for fresh air. She wandered the grounds, her steps leading her to the garden where Gina and Walter had been during the performance. The path was secluded, screened by overgrown shrubs, and offered a clear view of the study window. She examined the ground, noting a patch of disturbed earth near a yew hedge. Kneeling, she found a faint impression, perhaps from a shoe, though rain had blurred its edges. Had someone stood here, watching or waiting? The garden's isolation, she realized, made it a perfect vantage point for a hidden act. Returning to the house, Miss Marple paused in the drawing room, her eyes drawn to the fireplace mirror. She approached it, testing its angle. It reflected the room's entrance, but a slight tilt could show the study door. A trick of perspective, she thought, could hide movement, especially during the chaos of the performance. She recalled Alex's precise direction, the way the lamps had been positioned to cast shadows. Was it possible the shot had been fired elsewhere, the sound masked by the boys' clamor? Her thoughts were interrupted by Ernie Gregg, who appeared at the drawing-room door carrying a tray of tea things. His grin was as sly as ever, but his eyes darted nervously as he noticed Miss Marple's scrutiny. "Just helping out, miss," he said, his tone overly casual. Miss Marple smiled, her voice gentle. "You were quite the star last night, Ernie," she said. "You must enjoy the stage." Ernie's grin widened, but his fingers tightened on the tray. "Just a bit of fun," he said, slipping away quickly. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind turning to Stephen's words about Ernie's sneaking. Had he taken the letter or seen something he shouldn't? As evening approached, Miss Marple joined Carrie Louise in the library, a quiet room lined with dusty books. Carrie Louise, her hands trembling, confided her fears. "Christian was worried about the Institute's funds," she said, her voice low. "He wouldn't tell me more, but I know he suspected something. Louis has been so secretive lately." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. Embezzlement, perhaps? She recalled Lewis's intense focus on the Institute, his guarded demeanor during the inspector's questions. Was he protecting the Institute or himself? The day ended with the household in a state of uneasy quiet, the shadow of murder hanging over Stonygates. Miss Marple retired to her room. Her knitting resumed as she sat by the window, gazing at the dark expanse of the estate. The scuff mark, the mirror, the disturbed earth in the garden, all were clues, small but significant, in a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. She thought of Alex's theatrical flair, Lewis's fervent mission, Ernie's sly cunning. Each played a role, but whose performance hid the truth? As her needles clicked, Miss Marple resolved to watch closely, knowing that the smallest slip, a glance, a gesture, would lead her to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 5. A Glimpse Behind the Curtain. The second day at Stonygates dawned with a persistent drizzle, the gray sky casting a pall over the estate's sprawling grounds. Miss Jane Marple sat by the drawing-room fire, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm, though her pale blue eyes were alert, scanning the room for the subtle cues that revealed more than words. The household was subdued, the shock of Christian Gulbranson's murder settling into a heavy unease. The police tape on the study door remained, a stark reminder of the violence that had shattered the previous night's performance. Miss Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, felt the weight of secrets in the air, as tangible as the damp seeping through the old walls. Carrie Louise, pale and fragile, joined Miss Marple by the fire, her hands trembling as she poured tea from a chipped porcelain pot. Her smile was brave, but strained, and Miss Marple noted the faint shadows under her friend's eyes, a sign of sleepless worry. "Jane," Carrie Louise said softly, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the flames. "I can't believe Christian is gone. He was so steadfast, so loyal to our work here." She paused, her fingers tightening around her cup. "I feel something is terribly wrong, beyond what we see." Miss Marple patted her hand, her tone gentle, but her mind racing. Carrie Louise's intuition, she knew, was often clouded by her trust in others, yet her words echoed the unease Miss Marple had sensed since her arrival. The morning passed quietly, with Inspector Curry and his men combing the study for further clues. The household, under orders to remain available, moved through their routines with a forced normalcy. Lewis Saracold was absent, closeted with the inspector, his ledger once again in hand as he answered questions about the Institute's finances. Gina Hudd, her usual vivacity dimmed, lingered in the drawing room, flipping through a magazine without reading it. Walter Hudd, his brooding presence more pronounced, paced the hall, his footsteps echoing on the worn floorboards. Mildred Strata, seated across from Miss Marple, stitched a grim needlepoint, her lips pursed in silent disapproval of the chaos that had engulfed Stonygates. Alex Restorick, his theatrical charm subdued, was nowhere to be seen, though Miss Marple had heard him earlier, directing the reform boys in a subdued rehearsal in the garden. As the fire dwindled, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose, her steps slow but purposeful. She had resolved to explore the study, sealed though it was, in the hope of uncovering a clue the police might have overlooked. Slipping into the hall, she paused at the study door, its police tape a stark barrier. The lock, she noted, was heavy, the bolt still in place, but her village-bred instincts told her that locked rooms often hid simple solutions. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead mystery, where a locked shed had been breached through a forgotten trapdoor. Here, the answer might be less obvious, but no less practical. Finding the hall empty, Miss Marple slipped past the tape, her movements careful to avoid notice. The study was dim, the curtains drawn, and the air held a faint metallic tang. Christian's desk, now cleared of his body, bore the marks of police scrutiny. Fingerprint dust coated the surface, and the revolver was gone, taken for evidence. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were drawn to the carpet near the desk, where a faint scorch mark caught her attention. It was small, barely noticeable, but its presence suggested something more than a stray cigarette. Kneeling carefully, she examined it, her fingers brushing the fibers. The mark was fresh, the carpet slightly singed, as if a small flame or spark had touched it briefly. A stage trick, perhaps? She thought of Alex's theatrical expertise, the way he had manipulated light and sound the previous night. A blank shot, timed to coincide with the real one, could have created the illusion of a locked-room murder. Rising, Miss Marple moved to the fireplace, its grate cold, but bearing traces of ash. She sifted through the remains, her fingers deft despite her age, and found a fragment of paper, its edges charred but a few words legible. Discrepancy, trust, urgent. Her heart quickened. The missing letter, she suspected, had been burned to conceal its contents. Christian's concerns about the Institute's accounts, hinted at by Carrie Louise, were taking shape. Had he uncovered something that threatened someone in this house? Her exploration was interrupted by a creak in the hall, and she slipped back to the door, peering through the crack. Ernie Gregg, the sly reform boy, stood outside, his eyes darting nervously as he clutched a broom. He hesitated, then moved away, his footsteps quick and furtive. Miss Marple's mind turned to Stephen's words about Ernie's pilfering. Had he been in the study before the murder? Perhaps. Taking the letter, or delivering it to someone else? She made a mental note to speak with him, her gentle manner a perfect tool for coaxing truths from the wary. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Gina, alone, her magazine discarded. The young woman's face was pale, her eyes troubled, and Miss Marple seized the opportunity to probe. "You must be dreadfully shaken, my dear," she said, settling beside her. "Such a terrible thing, and in the midst of all that noise." Gina nodded, her fingers twisting her handkerchief. "It was awful," she said. "Walter and I were outside, but the shot, it was so loud, even in the garden." She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the hall. "Walter's been so angry lately. He thinks Lewis is hiding something, controlling everything." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression one of mild concern. "Hiding something?" she prompted. Gina bit her lip. "Money, maybe. Walter says the Institute's funds don't add up, but Lewis never explains." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm afraid for him, Aunt Jane. He's not himself." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. Walter's resentment, Gina's fear, and Christian's burned letter pointed to a financial motive. She recalled Lewis's intense focus on the Institute, his guarded responses to Inspector Curry. Was he protecting the Institute's mission or covering a deeper secret? And what of Alex, whose performance had so neatly masked the murder? His theatrical skills could stage a crime as easily as a play. As noon approached, Miss Marple ventured outside, her umbrella shielding her from the drizzle. The reform boys were at work in the fields, their figures blurred by the rain, but she spotted Stephen, the quiet lad, mending a fence. Approaching with her disarming smile, she engaged him in conversation, asking about the boys' routines. Stephen, his hands busy with wire, spoke cautiously. "Ernie's always boasting," he said, glancing toward the dormitory. "Says he knows things about the house, secrets. He was in the study a few days ago, looking for souvenirs. Saw Mr. Sericold burning papers once?" Miss Marple's heart quickened. The burned fragment, the scorch mark. Ernie's presence tied them together. "Did he say what the papers were?" she asked, her tone light. Stephen shook his head. "Just said they looked important. Ernie's like that, always poking where he shouldn't." Returning to the house, Miss Marple paused in the garden, her eyes drawn to the yew hedge where she had found the disturbed earth. The rain had softened the ground, but the shoe print remained, faint but distinct. It was small, perhaps a boy's, and she thought of Ernie's quick movements, his sly grin. Had he been in the garden during the performance, watching or acting? The garden's seclusion, she realized, made it an ideal spot for a hidden deed, its view of the study window, unobstructed. Lunch was a tense affair, the dining room's long table set with a meager spread of cold meats and bread. Lewis, back from his meeting with Inspector Curry, was pale, his eyes avoiding the household's questioning glances. Gina tried to lighten the mood, chatting about the Institute's plans, but her words fell flat. Walter, silent, stared at his plate, his knuckles white around his fork. Mildred, her needlepoint resumed, muttered about the reform boy's influence, her voice sharp with accusation. "One of them did it," she said, glaring at Lewis. "You let them roam free." Lewis's face tightened, but he responded calmly, insisting the boys were under strict supervision. Alex, attempting to restore his charm, spoke of a new theatrical project, but his voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple noted the nervous tap of his fingers. After lunch, Miss Marple slipped back to the drawing room, her eyes drawn to the fireplace mirror. She tested its angle again, confirming that a slight tilt could reflect the study door, potentially hiding movement during the performance's chaos. She thought of the scorch mark, the burned paper, and Ernie's pilfering. A blank shot, she mused, could have been fired to mask the real one, the sound swallowed by the boys' clamor. Alex's expertise, Lewis's secrecy, Ernie's cunning, all were threads in a tangled web. As evening fell, Miss Marple joined Carrie Louise in the library, the quiet room a refuge from the house's tension. Carrie Louise, her hands trembling, confided further. "Christian was auditing the accounts," she said, her voice low. "He found something, discrepancies, he called them. He wouldn't tell me more, but he was worried." She paused, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. "Lewis has been so distant, Jane. I fear he's hiding something to protect me." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. The burned letter, the scorch mark, Christian's concerns, all pointed to a financial motive, perhaps embezzlement. But who was the culprit? Lewis, protecting his institute, or someone else, exploiting his trust? The day ended with the household in a state of uneasy quiet, the rain drumming against the windows. Miss Marple retired to her room. Her knitting resumed as she sat by the window, gazing at the dark expanse of the estate. The scorch mark, the burned fragment, the shoe print in the garden. Each was a clue, small but significant, in a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. She thought of Alex's theatrical flair, Lewis's guarded intensity, Ernie's sly presence. Someone, she knew, had orchestrated the murder with the precision of a stage director, using the performance as a curtain to hide the truth. As her needles clicked, Miss Marple resolved to unravel the deception, knowing that the smallest detail, A mark, a glance, a slip would lead her to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 6. The Shadow of Motive. The drizzle of the previous day had given way to a fitful sun, its light filtering through the heavy clouds to cast fleeting shadows across the grounds of Stonygates. Miss Jane Marple sat in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with wilted ferns and the faint scent of damp earth, her knitting needles moving with their steady, comforting rhythm. The conservatory, though neglected, offered a clear view of the estate's fields, where the reform boys toiled under the watchful eyes of their instructors. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, followed their movements, but her thoughts were elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of Christian Gulbranson's murder. The locked study, the wiped revolver, the burned letter fragment, the scorch mark on the carpet, all pointed to a carefully staged crime, and she sensed the motive lay hidden in the tensions simmering within the household. The morning had brought news from Inspector Curry, delivered during a tense breakfast in the dining room. The inspector, his lean frame filling the doorway, had revealed a breakthrough. Christian Gulbranson's audit of the Institute's accounts had uncovered a significant discrepancy. Funds siphoned off to an unknown account, disguised as routine expenses. Mr. Gulbranson was preparing a report, Curry said, his sharp eyes scanning the faces at the table. It seems he suspected someone close to the Institute. Louis Saracold, his face pale, dismissed the discrepancy as a clerical error, his voice calm, but his hands gripping the table's edge. Christian was thorough, he said. He might have misread the figures. I'll provide full access to the books. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the strain in his tone, the way his eyes avoided Carrie Louise's worried gaze. The household's reactions were telling. Gina Hudd, her vibrancy muted, glanced at Walter, whose scowl deepened as he muttered about shady dealings. Mildred Strata, her needlepoint abandoned, declared the reform boys the likely culprits, her voice sharp with accusation. They're thieves by nature, she said, glaring at Louis. Alex Restorick, attempting to lighten the mood, suggested the error was a misunderstanding, but his usual charm faltered, his fingers tapping nervously. Miss Marple, her knitting a pretext for observation, sensed a web of motives, greed, resentment, fear, tightening around Stonygates. After breakfast, Miss Marple sought solitude in the conservatory, her mind turning to the burned letter fragment she had found in the study's fireplace. The words discrepancy, trust, urgent, suggested Christian had been on the verge of exposing a betrayal. She recalled Carrie Louise's confession about Louis's secretive behavior, his late nights poring over accounts. Was he shielding someone or concealing his own actions? And what of Alex, whose theatrical performance had so neatly masked the murder? His flair for illusion could extend to financial deception, she thought, especially given his lavish lifestyle, which seemed at odds with his modest income as a theater director. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple ventured into the garden, her umbrella shielding her from the occasional raindrop. The yew hedge, where she had found the faint shoe print, drew her attention. She examined the ground again, noting the print's small size, perhaps a boy's or a woman's. The hedge offered a clear view of the study window, and she imagined someone standing there, hidden in the dusk, timing their actions to the chaos of the performance. The garden's seclusion, she realized, made it a perfect stage for a hidden act, its shadows a cloak for deceit. As she returned to the house, Miss Marple encountered Gina, who was pacing the terrace, her face troubled. Seizing the opportunity, Miss Marple engaged her with her usual disarming charm. "You seem restless, my dear," she said, her tone gentle. Gina sighed, her fingers twisting a stray curl. "It's Walter," she admitted. "He's so angry all the time, Aunt Jane. He thinks Louis is manipulating the estate, keeping us from what's ours." She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the house. "He's been talking about the accounts, saying they don't add up. I don't know what to believe." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking in her mind. Walter's resentment, she thought, could be a motive or a distraction. Had he been in the garden, acting on his anger, or was he a pawn in a larger scheme? The afternoon brought a visit from Inspector Curry, who gathered the household in the drawing room to share further findings. The revolver, he confirmed, was registered to Louis, kept in a locked drawer in the study. "It was stolen, I presume," Louis said, his voice steady but his eyes guarded. "I hadn't checked the drawer in weeks." Curry's gaze sharpened. "Yet it was used in the murder and wiped clean. Someone knew where to find it." The room stirred, glances darting between Louis, Alex, and Walter. Miss Marple, seated quietly, noted the tension in Louis's posture, the way Alex's hand twitched as if to smooth his hair but stopped short. Curry turned to Alex, his tone measured. "Your performance was well-timed, Mr. Restorick. The shot coincided perfectly with the climax." Alex laughed, a hollow sound. "Theater is all about timing, Inspector. I was directing the boys, nothing more." His eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, and she saw a flicker of unease. She thought of the scorch mark in the study, the possibility of a blank shot fired to mask the real one. Alex's expertise, she mused, could orchestrate such a deception. But why? Was he protecting himself or someone else? As the inspector departed, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, her eyes drawn to the fireplace mirror. She tested its angle again, confirming that a slight adjustment could reflect the study door, potentially hiding movement. During the performance's chaos, the scorch mark, she thought, was key. A trace of a theatrical trick, perhaps a blank cartridge fired to create the illusion of a locked-room murder. She recalled a village fete where a magician had used a similar ruse, distracting the crowd with noise while his assistant slipped away. Here the stakes were deadly, the players more cunning. Seeking further insight, Miss Marple wandered to the reform boys' dormitory, where she found Stephen, the quiet lad, repairing a chair in the workshop. She engaged him with her gentle questions, asking about the performance. Stephen, his hands steady on the wood, spoke cautiously. "Ernie was the star," he said, glancing toward the fields. "He loves the attention, but he's tricky. I saw him near the study before the show, poking around. Said he was looking for props." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Ernie's presence in the study, combined with the burned letter fragment, suggested he might have seen, or taken, something critical. "Did he mention anything unusual?" she asked. Stephen shook his head. "Just boasted about knowing secrets. Ernie's always talking big." Returning to the house, Miss Marple paused in the hall, her eyes drawn to the study door, still sealed with police tape. She thought of the revolver, its clean surface a deliberate erasure of evidence. The locked room, she knew, was a puzzle designed to mislead, but her village instincts told her the solution was simple, hidden in plain sight. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead theft, where a locked gate had been bypassed through a hidden latch. Here, the answer might lie in the timing, the distraction of the performance. Dinner was a strained affair, the dining room's faded grandeur amplifying the household's tension. Gina, attempting to ease the mood, spoke of plans for the Institute, but her words lacked conviction. Walter, his silence heavier than ever, stared at Louis, his eyes dark with suspicion. Mildred, picking at her food, muttered about the reform boy's influence, her voice sharp with blame. "This is what comes of indulgence," she said, glaring at Louis. Alex, his charm strained, recounted a theatrical anecdote, but his laughter rang hollow. Louis, responding to Mildred's accusations, defended the boys with a fervor that bordered on desperation, his hands clenching the tablecloth. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, observed the interplay. Louis's defense of the boys was passionate, but his guarded demeanor suggested he was protecting more than their reputation. Alex's forced gaiety, she thought, was a mask, perhaps to deflect suspicion. Walter's anger, Gina's worry, Mildred's bitterness, each was a thread in a tangled web, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel it. She thought of the shoe print in the garden, the scorch mark, the burned letter fragment. Each clue pointed to a motive, and she suspected it lay in the Institute's finances. A secret Christian had died to expose. As the meal ended, Miss Marple excused herself, claiming a need for air. She wandered to the garden, her umbrella shielding her from the evening's chill. The yew hedge, its shadows deepening, drew her attention. She examined the shoe print again, noting its clarity despite the rain. It was small, perhaps Ernie's, and its position suggested someone had stood there, watching the study window during the performance. She imagined a figure in the dusk, timing their actions to the chaos of Alex's play. The garden's seclusion, she realized, made it a perfect stage for a hidden act, its view of the study unobstructed. Returning to the house, Miss Marple paused in the drawing room, her eyes drawn to the fireplace mirror. She tested its angle once more, confirming that a slight tilt could conceal movement from the study door. The scorch mark, she thought, was a clue to a theatrical trick, a blank shot fired to mask the real one, its sound swallowed by the boys' clamor. She recalled Ernie's sly presence, his boast of knowing secrets. Had he been a pawn or a player in the deception? As night fell, Miss Marple joined Carrie Louise in the library, the quiet room a refuge from the house's tension. Carrie Louise, her hands trembling, confided further. "Christian suspected someone was betraying the Institute," she said, her voice low. "He wouldn't name them, but he was adamant it had to stop. I fear it cost him his life." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. The burned letter, the financial discrepancy, Christian's audit, all pointed to embezzlement. But who was the culprit? Louis, with his fervent mission? Alex, with his lavish lifestyle? Or someone else, hidden behind the curtain of Stony Gates's secrets? The day ended with the household in a state of uneasy quiet, the shadows of suspicion lengthening. Miss Marple retired to her room, her knitting resumed as she sat by the window, gazing at the dark expanse of the estate. The shoe print, the scorch mark, the burned letter fragment, each was a piece of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. She thought of Alex's theatrical precision, Louis's guarded intensity, Ernie's cunning presence. Someone had staged a murder with the skill of a director, using the performance as a veil. As her needles clicked, Miss Marple resolved to pierce that veil, knowing that the truth lay in the smallest details, a mark, a glance, a hidden motive. Chapter 7. The Missing Letter. The third day at Stonygates broke with a pale sun struggling through the ever-present clouds, casting a wan light over the estate's weathered facades. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, a quiet nook off the main hall, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, measured rhythm. The room, with its faded chintz curtains and chipped porcelain ornaments, offered a respite from the household's mounting tension. But Miss Marple's pale blue eyes were sharp, her mind sifting through the clues that had accumulated since Christian Gulbranson's murder. The locked study, the wiped revolver, the scorched carpet, the faint shoe print in the garden, all were pieces of a puzzle, and she sensed the missing letter, burned in the study's fireplace, held the key to unlocking it. Her village-honed instincts told her that the truth lay not in grand gestures, but in the small, overlooked details that others dismissed. The household was restless, the air thick with suspicion, as Inspector Curry's investigation deepened. At breakfast, the dining room had been a study in strained silences. Carrie Louise, her frail hands trembling, had barely touched her tea, her eyes darting to Louis with unspoken questions. Louis Saracold, his ledger closed for once, had spoken little, his face drawn as he deflected Mildred's pointed remarks about the reform boy's influence. Gina Hudd, her usual brightness dulled, had sat close to Walter, whose brooding silence seemed to deepen with each passing hour. Alex Restorick, his theatrical charm fraying, had attempted a light-hearted comment about the weather, but his voice lacked conviction, and his fingers fidgeted with a napkin. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, had noted the undercurrents: fear, resentment, guilt, swirling beneath the surface, each person playing a role in a drama they did not fully understand. After breakfast, Miss Marple had overheard Inspector Curry speaking with Louis in the hall, his tone brisk but probing. "The missing letter is critical," Curry said. "If Gulbranson named a suspect, we need to know who." Louis's response was measured, insisting he had no knowledge of the letter's contents, but his hands betrayed a nervous twitch. Miss Marple, lingering unobtrusively, recalled the charred fragment she had found. Words like discrepancy and urgent, suggesting a financial betrayal. The letter, she suspected, had been destroyed to conceal a truth that threatened someone in this house. Determined to uncover more, Miss Marple slipped into the drawing room, where the remnants of Alex's performance lingered in the scuff marks on the floor. She paused by the fireplace, her eyes drawn to the mirror above it, its angle still a point of curiosity. The reflection could hide movement, she thought, especially during the chaos of the boys' play. The scorch mark on the study carpet, too, nagged at her, a trace of a theatrical trick, perhaps a blank shot fired to mask the real one. Her mind turned to Alex, whose expertise could orchestrate such a deception, and to Ernie Gregg, the sly reform boy whose pilfering ways might have placed him at the heart of the crime. Seeking a lead, Miss Marple ventured to the kitchen, where she found Ernie polishing silver, his quick fingers moving with practiced ease. His grin, as always, was sharp, but his eyes darted nervously as she approached. "Good morning, Ernie," she said, her tone gentle and disarming. "You were quite the performer the other night. You must enjoy a bit of mischief." Ernie's grin widened, but his hands paused. "Just playing my part, miss," he said, his voice overly casual. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes keen. "I hear you're good at finding things. Pens, papers, that sort. Ever find anything interesting in the study?" Ernie's grin faltered, and he glanced toward the door. "Saw Mr. Sarah Cold burning papers once," he said, his tone cautious. "Few days back. Looked like letters, but I didn't read 'em." Miss Marple nodded, her heart quickening. The burned fragment, she thought, was no accident. Had Ernie taken the letter, or merely witnessed its destruction? Returning to the morning room, Miss Marple pondered Ernie's words. Lewis burning papers suggested he was hiding something, perhaps the very letter Christian had written. She recalled Carrie Louise's confession about Christian's suspicions, his audit uncovering discrepancies in the Institute's funds. Was Lewis protecting the Institute's reputation or his own? Her thoughts were interrupted by Gina, who entered, her face pale, but her eyes sharp with worry. "Aunt Jane," she said, sinking into a chair. "I don't know what to do. Walter's so angry. He thinks Lewis is cheating us, hiding money from the estate." She hesitated, her fingers twisting a bracelet. "He's been talking about confronting him, and I'm afraid he'll do something rash." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression one of mild concern. "Anger can cloud judgment," she said. "Does Walter have any proof?" Gina shook her head. "Just suspicions, but Christian's audit. It's got everyone on edge." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Walter's resentment, fueled by financial concerns, could be a motive, but his absence in the garden during the murder suggested he was either innocent or cleverly positioned. She thought of Alex, whose lavish lifestyle hinted at a need for funds beyond his means. The Institute's accounts, she suspected, were the key, and the missing letter had likely named the culprit, or come close to it. As noon approached, Miss Marple wandered to the study door, still sealed with police tape. She paused, her eyes scanning the frame for any sign of tampering. The lock was sturdy, the bolt heavy, but her instincts told her the locked room was a deception, a stage trick to mislead. She recalled a Saint, Mary Mead burglary, where a locked window had been staged to hide a simpler entry. Here, the answer might lie in the timing of the shot, perfectly aligned with the performance's chaos. She thought of the garden shoe print, small and distinct, and wondered if Ernie had played a role beyond pilfering. At lunch, the dining room was a study in tension, the long table set with a sparse spread of cold cuts and bread. Lewis, his face drawn, spoke little, his eyes fixed on his plate. Gina, attempting to ease the mood, chatted about the Institute's future, but her voice lacked conviction. Walter, his silence heavy, stared at Lewis with barely concealed hostility. Mildred, her needlepoint resumed, muttered about the reform boy's influence, her voice sharp with blame. "This is what comes of mixing with criminals," she said, glaring at Lewis. Alex, his charm strained, recounted a theatrical anecdote, but his laughter was forced, his eyes darting to the study door. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, observed the interplay. Lewis's silence, she thought, was a shield, hiding either guilt or fear. Alex's forced gaiety suggested a man deflecting suspicion, his theatrical skills a potential tool for deception. Walter's anger, Gina's worry, Mildred's bitterness, each was a thread in a tangled web, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel it. She thought of the scorched carpet, the burned letter fragment, the garden shoe print. Each clue pointed to a motive, likely financial, but the players remained elusive. After lunch, Miss Marple ventured to the reform boys' dormitory, her steps slow but purposeful across the damp lawn. She found Stephen, the quiet lad, mending a gate, his hands steady with a hammer. Engaging him with her gentle charm, she asked about Ernie's habits. Stephen, glancing toward the fields, spoke cautiously. "Ernie's always sneaking around," he said. "Brags about getting into the house, taking things. Said he saw something in the study once. Papers, maybe, but he wouldn't say more." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Ernie's presence in the study, combined with his boast of secrets, suggested he might have seen, or taken, the letter before it was burned. Returning to the house, Miss Marple paused in the garden, her eyes drawn to the yew hedge where the shoe print lay. The rain had softened it, but its outline remained, small and deliberate. She imagined Ernie standing there, watching the study window during the performance, perhaps acting on orders. The garden's seclusion, she realized, made it a perfect vantage point for a hidden deed, its view of the study unobstructed. She thought of the mirror in the drawing room, its angle capable of concealing movement, and the scorch mark, a clue to a staged shot. As evening approached, Miss Marple joined Carrie Louise in the library, the quiet room a refuge from the house's tension. Carrie Louise, her hands trembling, confided further. "Christian was certain someone was betraying us," she said, her voice low. "He spoke of discrepancies, of funds misused. I begged him to tell me more, but he said it was too dangerous." She paused, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. "Lewis has been so distant, Jane. I fear he's protecting someone, or something." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. The burned letter, the financial discrepancies, Christian's audit, all pointed to embezzlement. But who was the culprit? Lewis, with his fervent mission? Alex, with his extravagant habits? Or Ernie, a pawn in a larger game? The day ended with the household in a state of uneasy quiet, the shadows of suspicion deepening. Miss Marple retired to her room. Her knitting resumed as she sat by the window, gazing at the dark expanse of the estate. The shoe print, the scorch mark, the burned letter fragment. Each was a piece of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. She thought of Alex's theatrical precision, Lewis's guarded intensity, Ernie's cunning presence. Someone had staged a murder with the skill of a master illusionist, using the performance as a veil. As her needles clicked, Miss Marple resolved to pierce that veil, knowing that the truth lay in the smallest details. A mark, a glance, a hidden letter. Chapter 8. The Second Act. The fourth day at Stonygates unfolded under a sky heavy with the threat of rain, the air thick with the scent of wet grass and old stone. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting needles moving with their steady, almost meditative rhythm, the soft click-clack a counterpoint to the restless murmur of the household. The room, with its faded wallpaper and mismatched chairs, offered a quiet vantage point, and Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp despite her unassuming demeanor, missed nothing. The murder of Christian Gulbrandsen had cast a long shadow over the estate, and the clues, the scorched carpet, the burned letter fragment, the faint shoe print in the garden, were beginning to form a pattern in her mind. Yet the motive, she sensed, lay buried in the tangled relationships and hidden resentments of the household, waiting to be unearthed. The morning had begun with a fresh disturbance, shattering the uneasy calm that had settled over Stonygates. At breakfast, Walter Hudd, his brooding silence finally breaking, had erupted in a tirade against Louis Sericold. His voice, rough with his American accent, had carried through the dining room as he accused Louis of manipulating Gina's inheritance. "You're bleeding this place dry, Sericold," he had shouted, slamming his fist on the table, rattling the chipped china. "Hiding money, keeping us in the dark." Gina, pale and trembling, had tried to calm him, her hand on his arm, but Walter had shaken her off, his eyes blazing. Louis, his face a mask of controlled calm, had responded evenly, insisting the estate's funds were secure and dedicated to the Institute's mission. "You're mistaken, Walter," he had said, though his hands clenched briefly, betraying tension. The outburst had ended abruptly when Walter, his anger spent, stormed out, leaving the household in stunned silence. Carrie Louise, her frail hands clutching her teacup, had looked to Miss Marple with a plea in her eyes, as if seeking reassurance. Mildred Straighty, her lips pursed, had muttered about Walter's uncouth behavior, while Alex Restorick, his theatrical charm strained, had attempted to lighten the mood with a forced jest about temperamental actors. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, had noted the undercurrents: Walter's rage, Gina's fear, Louis's guarded composure. The accusation of financial manipulation, she thought, echoed Christian's audit and the burned letter fragment, suggesting a deeper truth. As the household dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the morning room, her mind turning to Walter's outburst. His resentment, she suspected, was more than personal. It was rooted in a belief that Louis was siphoning funds, perhaps tied to the discrepancies Christian had uncovered. She recalled the garden shoe print, small and deliberate, and wondered if Walter's anger had led him to act, or if he was a convenient scapegoat in a larger scheme. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion in the hall, shouts and the clatter of furniture, drawing her to her feet. In the corridor she found Walter, his face flushed, grappling with two reform boys who were restraining him. A knife, its blade glinting in the dim light, lay on the floor, and Ernie Gregg, the sly youth, stood nearby, his grin sharp but his eyes wary. "He went mad, miss," Ernie said, catching sight of Miss Marple. "Tried to come at Mr. Saracold with that." Walter, his arms pinned, glared at Louis, who stood at the end of the hall, his face pale but composed. "You're a thief." Walter spat, his voice hoarse. "You'll pay for it." Louis, his voice steady, ordered the boys to release him, insisting it was a misunderstanding. "Walter's upset," he said, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's briefly. "We'll sort this out." Miss Marple, her knitting tucked in her bag, observed the scene with quiet intensity. Walter's rage was genuine, but the knife seemed out of character, a dramatic flourish that felt staged. She thought of Alex's theatrical expertise, the way he had orchestrated the performance to mask the murder. Was this another act, designed to cast suspicion on Walter? She noted Ernie's presence, his quick intervention suggesting more than a bystander's role. Had he been instructed to escalate the scene, or was he acting on his own cunning? Inspector Curry, summoned by the commotion, arrived to question Walter, who was now subdued, his anger replaced by a sullen silence. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I just wanted answers." Gina, tears in her eyes, stood by him, her hand on his shoulder. Curry, his notebook open, listened impassively, then turned to Louis. "This knife," he said, holding it up, "was found in the study drawer with the revolver. How did it get here?" Louis, his face tightening, claimed ignorance, insisting the drawer had been locked. "Someone must have taken it," he said, his voice calm, but his hands betraying a nervous twitch. Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively in the background, noted the parallel to the revolver. Another item from the study, conveniently appearing to incriminate Walter. She recalled the scorched carpet, the possibility of a blank shot fired to mask the real one, and wondered if this knife was part of the same illusion. Her thoughts turned to Ernie, whose sly grin and quick fingers suggested he might have moved the knife, perhaps on orders. She resolved to speak with him, her gentle manner a perfect tool for coaxing truths from the wary. After the incident, Miss Marple wandered to the garden, her umbrella shielding her from the gathering drizzle. The yew hedge where the shoe print lay drew her attention. She examined it again, noting its clarity despite the rain. It was small, possibly Ernie's, and its position suggested someone had stood there, watching the study window during the performance. She imagined a figure in the dusk, timing their actions to the chaos of Alex's play. The garden's seclusion, she realized, made it a perfect vantage point for a hidden act, its view of the study unobstructed. She thought of Walter's claim of being in the garden with Gina. Had he seen something or been part of it? Returning to the house, Miss Marple sought out Ernie, finding him in the kitchen, polishing cutlery with his usual deftness. "You're quick to act, Ernie," she said, her tone mild but her eyes keen. That was quite a scene with Mr. Hudd. Ernie's grin flashed, but his eyes darted nervously. "Just doing my part, miss," he said, his voice casual. He was out of control. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking in her mind. "You seem to find yourself in the thick of things," she said. "Ever see anything unusual in the study before all this?" Ernie's grin faltered, and he hesitated. "Might have seen Mr. Restorick there once," he said, his tone guarded. "Looking at papers, late at night." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Alex in the study, handling papers, perhaps the letter Christian had written. As noon approached, Miss Marple joined Carrie Louise in the library, the quiet room a refuge from the house's tension. Carrie Louise, her hands trembling, confided further. "Walter's anger frightens me," she said, her voice low. "He's always been restless, but it's as if he's lost all restraint. And Louis, he's so calm, but I know he's worried." She paused, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. "Christian's audit was troubling him, Jane. I think he found something terrible." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. The burned letter, the financial discrepancies, Walter's outburst, all pointed to a motive rooted in money, but the players remained elusive. Lunch was a strained affair, the dining room's faded elegance amplifying the household's unease. Gina, her face pale, sat close to Walter, who stared at his plate, his silence heavy. Mildred, her needlepoint resumed, muttered about the dangers of unchecked tempers, her eyes flicking to Walter with disdain. Alex, his charm strained, spoke of a new, theatrical project, but his voice lacked conviction, his fingers tapping nervously. Louis, responding to Mildred's barbs, defended the Institute's mission with a fervor that bordered on desperation, his hands clenching the tablecloth. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, observed the interplay. Walter's outburst, she thought, was a convenient distraction, casting him as the volatile suspect. Yet the knife, like the revolver, suggested a staged act, perhaps orchestrated by Alex or Louis. She thought of Ernie's revelation about Alex in the study, handling papers. Was he the embezzler Christian had suspected, or a pawn in Louis's larger plan? The scorched carpet, the burned letter fragment, the garden shoe print. Each clue pointed to a carefully planned deception, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel it. After lunch, Miss Marple slipped back to the drawing room, her eyes drawn to the fireplace mirror. She tested its angle again, confirming that a slight tilt could conceal movement from the study door. The scorch mark, she thought, was key. A trace of a blank shot, perhaps fired to mask the real one, its sound swallowed by the performance's chaos. She recalled a village magician's trick, where a loud noise had hidden a theft. Here, the stakes were deadly, the players more cunning. As evening fell, Miss Marple wandered to the study door, still sealed with police tape. She paused, her eyes scanning the frame for any sign of tampering. The lock was sturdy, the bolt heavy, but her instincts told her the locked room was a ruse, designed to mislead. She thought of the garden shoe print, Ernie's presence, Alex's late-night visits to the study. Each was a thread in a tangled web, and she suspected the motive lay in the Institute's funds, a secret Christian had died to expose. The day ended with the household in a state of uneasy quiet, the shadows of suspicion deepening. Miss Marple retired to her room, her knitting resumed as she sat by the window, gazing at the dark expanse of the estate. The shoe print, the scorch mark, the burned letter fragment, each was a piece of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. She thought of Alex's theatrical precision, Lewis's guarded intensity, Walter's volatile anger, Ernie's cunning presence. Someone had staged a murder with the skill of a master illusionist, using the performance as a curtain. As her needles clicked, Miss Marple resolved to pierce that curtain, knowing that the truth lay in the smallest details. A mark, a glance, a hidden act. Chapter 9. The Mirror's Trick. The fifth day at Stonygates dawned with a restless wind rattling the estate's ancient windows, the air sharp with the promise of an approaching storm. Miss Jane Marple sat in the conservatory, its glass walls misted with condensation, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. The faint scent of damp earth and wilted ferns filled the room, but her pale blue eyes, sharp behind, her spectacles were focused inward, piecing together the puzzle of Christian Gulbranson's murder. The scorched carpet, the burned letter fragment, the garden shoe print, and now the knife incident with Walter Hudd. All were threads in a tapestry of deception, and Miss Marple sensed the truth was close, hidden in the subtle interplay of the household's motives and masks. The morning had brought no new outbursts, but the tension in Stonygates was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. At breakfast, the dining room had been a study in guarded silences. Carrie Louise, her frail hands trembling, had barely spoken, her eyes darting to Lewis with a mix of worry and trust. Lewis Saracold, his ledger absent for once, had responded to Inspector Curry's latest questions with a calm that seemed almost rehearsed, his gray eyes avoiding direct contact. Gina Hudd, her vibrancy subdued, had sat close to Walter, whose sullen silence was broken only by curt nods. Mildred Strata, her needlepoint a grim companion, had muttered about the estate's decline, her voice sharp with blame. Alex Restorick, his theatrical charm fraying further, had attempted a light-hearted remark about the storm, but his fingers betrayed a nervous twitch. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, had noted the undercurrents. Fear, suspicion, guilt, each person playing a role in a drama they could not fully control. Inspector Curry had shared a new detail at breakfast, his lean frame commanding attention as he stood by the dining room door. "The revolver used in the murder," he said, his sharp eyes scanning the faces, "was fired twice. One bullet killed Mr. Gulbranson, the other, a blank, left the scorch mark on the carpet." The household stirred, glances darting between Lewis and Alex. A blank shot suggests a distraction, Curry continued, timed to coincide with the performance's chaos. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly, her mind racing. The scorch mark, she thought, was no accident. A theatrical trick to mask the real shot, orchestrated by someone with Alex's skill or Lewis's precision. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple slipped into the drawing room after breakfast, her steps slow but purposeful. The room, with its faded tapestries and tarnished mirrors, still bore traces of the performance, scuff marks on the floor, a discarded prop cup in a corner. She approached the fireplace mirror, its angle a persistent point of curiosity. Standing before it, she adjusted her position, noting how a slight tilt could reflect the study door, potentially concealing movement during the performance's clamor. She imagined a figure slipping from the drawing room to the study, hidden by the mirror's trick and the boy's noise. The blank shot, she thought, had been fired to draw attention to the study, creating the illusion of a locked room murder. Her thoughts were interrupted by Alex Restorick, who entered the room, his blonde hair disheveled, his charm replaced by a strained intensity. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile, "you're always so quiet, watching everything." His tone was light, but his eyes held a flicker of unease. Miss Marple smiled, her voice gentle but probing. "Your performance was quite remarkable, Mr. Restorick," she said. "The timing, the chaos, it was all so precise." Alex laughed, a hollow sound. "Theater is all about precision," he said, but his fingers tapped nervously. Miss Marple pressed on, her tone mild. "And mirrors, I find, can hide so much, like movement, during a distraction." Alex's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing for a moment before he recovered, excusing himself with a muttered apology. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Alex's unease, she thought, was telling. His theatrical expertise could have staged the blank shot, the mirror's angle concealing his movements. But why? She recalled Ernie's revelation about Alex in the study, handling papers late at night. Was he the embezzler Christian had suspected, or a pawn in a larger scheme? Her thoughts turned to Lewis, whose calm in the face of accusations suggested a deeper control. The burned letter fragment, with its words of discrepancy and urgent, pointed to a financial motive, but the players remained elusive. Seeking further insight, Miss Marple ventured to the reform boys' dormitory, her umbrella shielding her from the gusting wind. She found Stephen, the quiet lad, stacking firewood, his hands steady despite the chill. Engaging him with her disarming charm, she asked about the performance's preparations. Stephen, glancing toward the fields, spoke cautiously. "Mr. Restorick was particular about the timing," he said. "Told Ernie to make the noise loudest right at the end. Said it was for effect." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The timing of the blank shot, she thought, was no coincidence. It was designed to mask the real one, fired elsewhere. "Did Ernie ever mention anything about the study?" she asked. Stephen hesitated, then nodded. "Said he saw Mr. Restorick there, before the show, moving things around. Didn't say what." Returning to the house, Miss Marple paused in the garden, her eyes drawn to the yew hedge where the shoe print lay. The wind had scattered leaves across it, but the outline remained, small and deliberate. She imagined Ernie or Alex standing there, watching the study window during the performance, timing their actions to the chaos. The garden's seclusion, she realized, made it an ideal spot for a hidden act, its view of the study unobstructed. She thought of Walter and Gina's absence in the garden. Had they witnessed something or been part of it? At lunch, the dining room was a study in tension, the long table set with a sparse spread of soup and bread. Gina, her face pale, sat close to Walter, who stared at his bowl, his silence heavy with resentment. Mildred, her needlepoint resumed, muttered about the estate's decline, her eyes flicking to Louis with disdain. "This place is cursed," she said, her voice sharp. Alex, his charm strained, spoke of a new theatrical idea, but his words lacked conviction, his fingers tapping nervously. Louis, responding to Mildred's barbs, defended the Institute's mission with a fervor that bordered on desperation, his hands clenching the tablecloth. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, observed the interplay. Alex's unease, she thought, was a crack in his performance, a sign he was hiding something. Louis's calm, too, was a facade, concealing either guilt or fear. Walter's silence, Gina's worry, Mildred's bitterness, each was a thread in a tangled web, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel it. She thought of the scorched carpet, the burned letter fragment, the garden shoe print. Each clue pointed to a staged murder. The blank shot a key element in the deception. After lunch, Miss Marple slipped back to the drawing room, her eyes drawn to the fireplace mirror. She tested its angle again, confirming that a slight tilt could conceal movement from the study door. The scorch mark, she thought, was evidence of a blank shot, fired to create the illusion of a locked room murder. She recalled a village conjurer's trick, where a loud noise had hidden a theft. Here, the stakes were deadly, the players more cunning. She thought of Alex's expertise, Ernie's cunning, Louis's control. Someone had orchestrated the murder with the precision of a stage director, using the mirror's trick to hide their movements. Seeking to confirm her suspicions, Miss Marple approached Ernie, finding him in the kitchen polishing silver with his usual deftness. "You're quite the performer, Ernie," she said, her tone mild but her eyes keen. "You must enjoy a good trick." Ernie's grin flashed, but his eyes darted nervously. "Just doing what Mr. Restorick told me," he said, his voice casual. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking in her mind. "And the study? Ever help with props there?" Ernie's grin faltered, and he hesitated. "Might have moved some things for Mr. Restorick," he said, his tone guarded. "He said it was for the show." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Alex moving props in the study, Ernie's involvement, it suggested a planned deception. The blank shot a key element. As evening fell, Miss Marple joined Carrie Louise in the library, the quiet room a refuge from the house's tension. Carrie Louise, her hands trembling, confided further. "Christian was certain someone was stealing from the Institute," she said, her voice low. "He wouldn't name them, but he was preparing to act. I fear it's why he died." She paused, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. "Louis is so dedicated, Jane, but he's been so secretive. I don't know what to think." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. The burned letter, the financial discrepancies, the blank shot, all pointed to a motive rooted in money, but the culprit remained elusive. The day ended with the household in a state of uneasy quiet, the storm clouds gathering outside. Miss Marple retired to her room. Her knitting resumed as she sat by the window, gazing at the dark expanse of the estate. The shoe print, the scorch mark, the burned letter fragment. Each was a piece of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. She thought of Alex's theatrical precision, Lewis's guarded intensity, Ernie's cunning role. Someone had staged a murder with the skill of a master illusionist, using the mirror's trick to hide the truth. As her needles clicked, Miss Marple resolved to uncover that truth, knowing it lay in the smallest details. A mark, a glance, a hidden act. Chapter 10. The Embezzler's Game. The 6th day at Stonygates broke with a storm, the wind howling through the estate's ancient oaks and rattling the loose panes of the conservatory where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with their steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. The glass walls, streaked with rain, framed a world blurred by the downpour, but Miss Marple's pale blue eyes were sharp, her mind piecing together the intricate puzzle of Christian Gulbranson's murder. The scorched carpet, the burned letter fragment, the garden shoe print, the blank shot concealed by the mirror's trick, all pointed to a carefully orchestrated crime, and she sensed the motive lay in the financial discrepancies Christian had uncovered. The household, she knew, was a stage where each player hid their true role, and the truth was close, waiting to be revealed by a single misstep. The morning had brought a significant development from Inspector Curry, announced during a tense breakfast in the dining room. The inspector, his lean frame outlined against the rain-lashed window, had revealed a breakthrough. The Institute's accounts showed large sums diverted to an offshore account, traced to a name linked to Alex Restorick. Mr. Gulbranson's audit was thorough, Curry said, his sharp eyes scanning the faces at the table. He suspected embezzlement, and his letter likely named the culprit. The household stirred, glances darting to Alex, whose face paled, his theatrical charm replaced by a strained smile. Louis Saracold, his hands gripping his teacup, admitted he had suspected Alex but hoped to reform him. "I thought he could change," Louis said, his voice low but steady. "I didn't want to believe he'd betray us." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the reactions. Alex's forced composure, the way his fingers twitched as he brushed back his blonde hair, suggested guilt or fear of exposure. Louis's admission, delivered with a calm that bordered on calculated, raised her suspicions. Was he truly a betrayed benefactor, or was he orchestrating a larger deception? Gina Hudd, her face pale, glanced at Walter, whose sullen silence seemed to deepen, his eyes fixed on Alex with barely concealed contempt. Mildred Strata, her needlepoint abandoned, muttered about the folly of trusting outsiders, her gaze sharp with disdain. Carrie Louise, frail and trembling, looked to Miss Marple with a plea in her eyes, as if seeking reassurance in the face of betrayal. After breakfast, Miss Marple retreated to the conservatory, her mind turning to the clues she had gathered. The burned letter fragment, with its words of discrepancy and urgent, confirmed Christian's suspicions of embezzlement. The scorched carpet, evidence of a blank shot, suggested a theatrical trick to mask the real murder, likely orchestrated by Alex, whose expertise could stage such a deception. The garden shoe print, small and deliberate, pointed to Ernie Gregg's involvement, perhaps as a pawn in a larger scheme. Yet Louis's calm, his fervent defense of the Institute, nagged at her. Was he protecting Alex, or using him to conceal his own role? Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple slipped into the drawing room, its faded grandeur a silent witness to the previous night's revelations. The fireplace mirror, its angle a key to the murder's illusion, drew her attention. She stood before it, adjusting her position to confirm that a slight tilt could hide movement from the study door, creating the appearance of a locked-room crime. The blank shot, she thought, had been fired to draw attention to the study, masking the real shot fired elsewhere, perhaps in the garden where the shoe print lay. She recalled a village conjurer's trick where a loud noise had concealed a theft, and saw the parallel here, the stakes far higher. Her thoughts were interrupted by Alex, who entered the room, his charm replaced by a nervous energy. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile. "You're always so observant. Find anything interesting in this old place?" His tone was light, but his eyes held a flicker of unease. Miss Marple smiled, her voice gentle but probing. "Mirrors can be so deceptive, Mr. Restorick," she said. "They show us what we expect, not what is." Alex's smile faltered, his fingers tapping nervously. "Theater's full of tricks," he said, his voice strained. "But it's all just show." Miss Marple nodded, her heart quickening. Alex's unease, she thought, was a crack in his performance, a sign he was hiding more than a financial indiscretion. Seeking further insight, Miss Marple ventured to the reform boys' dormitory, her umbrella shielding her from the storm's fury. She found Stephen, the quiet lad, repairing a shutter, his hands steady despite the wind. Engaging him with her disarming charm, she asked about Alex's interactions with the boys. Stephen, glancing toward the fields, spoke cautiously. "Mr. Restorick was always giving Ernie special jobs," he said. "Said he was good at misdirection. Told him to move things in the study before the show." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Ernie moving items in the study under Alex's direction suggested a planned deception, perhaps the placement of the revolver or the letter's removal. Returning to the house, Miss Marple paused in the garden, her eyes drawn to the yew hedge where the shoe print lay. The rain had blurred its edges, but its outline remained, small and deliberate. She imagined Ernie standing there, watching the study window during the performance, perhaps acting on Alex's orders. The garden's seclusion, she realized, made it an ideal spot for a hidden act, its view of the study unobstructed. She thought of Walter and Gina's presence in the garden. Had they been unwitting witnesses or part of the scheme? At lunch, the dining room was a study in tension, the long table set with a meager spread of soup and bread. Gina, her face pale, sat close to Walter, who stared at his bowl, his silence heavy with resentment. Mildred, her needlepoint resumed, muttered about the estate's decline, her eyes flicking to Alex with disdain. "Thieves among us," she said, her voice sharp. Alex, his charm strained, spoke of a new theatrical project, but his words lacked conviction, his fingers tapping nervously. Lewis, responding to Mildred's barbs, defended the Institute's mission with a fervor that bordered on desperation, his hands clenching the tablecloth. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, observed the interplay. Alex's unease, she thought, was a sign of guilt, his theatrical skills a tool for deception. Lewis's calm, however, was more troubling. His admission of suspecting Alex suggested he was either a victim or a mastermind. She thought of the scorched carpet, the burned letter fragment, the garden shoe print. Each clue pointed to a staged murder, the blank shot a key element in the illusion. She recalled Ernie's role, his cunning presence in the study, and suspected he had been used to move the revolver or the letter, perhaps under Alex's direction. After lunch, Miss Marple slipped back to the drawing room, her eyes drawn to the fireplace mirror. She tested its angle again, confirming that a slight tilt could conceal movement from the study door. The scorch mark, she thought, was evidence of a blank shot, fired to create the illusion of a locked room murder. She imagined Alex orchestrating the performance, directing Ernie to fire the blank while the real shot was fired in the garden. The body moved to the study. But why would Lewis allow such a scheme unless he was the true architect, using Alex as a scapegoat? Seeking to confirm her suspicions, Miss Marple approached Ernie, finding him in the kitchen, polishing silver with his usual deftness. "You're quite the helper, Ernie," she said, her tone mild, but her eyes keen. "Always in the right place for Mr. Restorick's plans." Ernie's grin flashed, but his eyes darted nervously. "Just doing what I'm told, miss," he said, his voice casual. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking in her mind. "And in the study, did Mr. Restorick ask you to move anything special?" Ernie's grin faltered, and he hesitated. "Might have moved a gun," he said, his tone guarded. "For the show," he said. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Ernie's admission confirmed her suspicions. The revolver had been staged, the blank shot a deliberate ruse. As evening fell, Miss Marple joined Carrie Louise in the library, the quiet room a refuge from the house's tension. Carrie Louise, her hands trembling, confided further. "Christian's audit was a threat," she said, her voice low. "He suspected someone close, someone he trusted. I fear Lewis knew and tried to protect them." She paused, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. "I don't want to believe it, Jane, but the accounts, they're tearing us apart." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. The burned letter, the financial discrepancies, the blank shot, all pointed to a motive rooted in embezzlement, with Alex as the likely culprit, but Lewis's role was unclear. The day ended with the household in a state of uneasy quiet, the storm raging outside. Miss Marple retired to her room, her knitting resumed as she sat by the window, gazing at the dark expanse of the estate. The shoe print, the scorch mark, the burned letter fragment, Ernie's admission, each was a piece of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. She thought of Alex's theatrical precision, Lewis's guarded intensity, Ernie's cunning role. Someone had staged a murder with the skill of a master illusionist, using the Institute's funds as the prize. As her needles clicked, Miss Marple resolved to uncover the truth, knowing it lay in the smallest details, a mark, a glance, a hidden game. Chapter 11. The Final Confrontation. The seventh day at Stonygates broke with a deceptive calm, the storm of the previous night giving way to a pale, watery sunlight that filtered through the estate's ancient windows. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing room, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, almost hypnotic rhythm, the soft click-clack blending with the distant creak of the house settling. The room, with its faded tapestries and tarnished mirrors, held a heavy silence, the weight of Christian Gulbranson's murder pressing down on the household. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, were fixed on the puzzle she had pieced together. The scorched carpet, the burned letter fragment, the garden shoe print, the blank shot, and Ernie Gregg's admission of moving the revolver. The clues pointed to a meticulously staged crime, and she was certain the motive lay in the embezzlement uncovered by Christian's audit. Today, she resolved, the truth would be revealed, for the threads of deception were ready to unravel. The morning had been quiet, the household moving through their routines with a forced normalcy that belied the tension beneath. At breakfast, Carrie Louise had been pale, her frail hands trembling as she poured tea, her eyes avoiding Louis Saracold's guarded gaze. Louis, his ledger absent, had spoken little, his face drawn as he deflected Mildred Strate's sharp remarks about the Institute's failures. Gina Hudd, her vibrancy muted, had sat close to Walter Hudd, whose sullen silence was broken only by curt nods. Alex Restorick, his theatrical charm all but gone, had attempted a light-hearted comment about the improving weather, but his fingers betrayed a nervous twitch. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, had noted the undercurrents. Fear, guilt, suspicion, each person playing a role in a drama nearing its climax. Inspector Curry had called the household to the drawing room after breakfast, his lean frame commanding attention as he stood by the fireplace. His notebook, filled with precise handwriting, lay open on a side table, and his sharp eyes scanned the faces before him. "We've made progress," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. The offshore account linked to Mr. Restorick received significant funds from the Institute, funds Mr. Gulbranson was about to expose. The blank shot in the study suggests a staged crime, designed to mislead. He paused, his gaze settling on Alex, whose face paled, his hands clenching briefly. Louis, standing nearby, looked away, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple, her knitting a pretext for observation, sensed the moment was ripe for the truth to emerge. Rising from her chair, Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm, her presence commanding a quiet authority. "If I may, Inspector," she said, her eyes meeting his with a nod. "I believe I can shed light on this tragedy." The household turned to her, their faces a mix of surprise and wariness. Carrie Louise clutched Gina's hand, her eyes wide with hope and fear. Walter's scowl deepened, while Mildred's lips pursed in skepticism. Alex's forced smile faltered, and Louis's hands tightened, his calm facade cracking. Miss Marple, her shawl neatly draped, began to unravel the mystery with the precision of her knitting. "The murder of Mr. Gulbranson," she said, her tone mild but unwavering, "was a mirror trick, a deception staged with theatrical precision. The blank shot in the study, marked by the scorched carpet, was fired to create the illusion of a locked room murder. The real shot, however, was fired elsewhere. In the garden, where a shoe print suggests someone stood, watching the study window." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room, noting Alex's nervous twitch and Louis's rigid posture. The performance, so carefully orchestrated by Mr. Restorick, was the perfect distraction, its chaos masking the true crime. She turned to Alex, her voice gentle but probing. "You, Mr. Restorick, have a talent for illusion. The mirror above the fireplace, angled just so, could hide movement from the study door. You directed Ernie Gregg to fire the blank shot, didn't you, to draw every eye to the study while the real murder took place outside." Alex's face drained of color, his hands trembling as he tried to laugh. "This is absurd," he said, his voice strained. "I was directing the boys, nothing more." But his eyes darted to Louis, a silent plea for support. Miss Marple turned to Louis, her gaze steady. "And you, Mr. Saracold, knew of Alex's embezzlement. Christian's audit threatened to expose it, didn't it? You orchestrated the performance, using Alex's skills to stage the murder, ensuring the blank shot covered the real one. The body was moved to the study, the door locked to create the illusion of an impossible crime." Louis's face tightened, his hands clenching, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. The household stirred, gasps and murmurs filling the room. Gina's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Walter's scowl softened, his anger replaced by confusion. Mildred, her needlepoint forgotten, stared at Louis with a mix of horror and vindication. Carrie Louise, tears in her eyes, whispered, "Louis, no, it can't be true." Miss Marple, her voice steady, continued. The letter Christian was writing, burned in the fireplace, named Alex as the embezzler. You, Mr. Saracold, ensured it was destroyed, didn't you? To protect the Institute, or yourself. Alex, cornered, broke, his voice rising in panic. "It was Louis's idea," he cried, pointing at his stepfather. "He told me to stage the performance, to use the blank shot. He said Christian had to be stopped, that the audit would ruin everything." Louis's face crumpled, his calm shattering. "I did it for the Institute," he said, his voice low but desperate. "Alex was stealing, yes, but I thought I could control him, reform him. Christian's audit would have destroyed our work, years of effort, gone. I told Alex to fire the blank, to create the distraction. He shot Christian in the garden, and we moved the body to the study." The room fell silent, the weight of the confession settling like dust. Inspector Curry stepped forward, his notebook snapping shut. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm. "Mr. Saracold, Mr. Restrick, you're both under arrest." As his men moved to restrain them, Carrie Louise swayed, Gina catching her as tears streamed down her face. "Oh, Jane," she whispered, "how could I not see?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her tone soothing. "You saw only the good, my dear, as you always do. But the truth has a way of coming to light." Walter, his silence broken, stepped forward, his voice gruff but softer. "I thought it was Louis, but not like this. I'm sorry, Gina." Gina nodded, her eyes wet but resolute. Mildred, for once speechless, gathered her needlepoint, her face pale. The reform boys, watching from the doorway, whispered among themselves, Ernie's sly grin replaced by a wary expression. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. The puzzle was complete, the threads of deception unraveled by the smallest clues. A scorch mark, a shoe print, a mirror's trick. As Curry led Louis and Alex away, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, her eyes drawn to the fireplace mirror. It stood silent now, its deceptive angle no longer needed. She thought of the village pageants in St. Mary Mead, where a clever trick could fool the crowd, but never for long. Here, the stakes had been deadly, the players cunning, but the truth had emerged, as it always did, in the quiet details that others overlooked. The household slowly dispersed, the weight of the revelation settling over Stonygates. Miss Marple joined Carrie Louise in the library, the quiet room a refuge from the storm of emotions. Carrie Louise, her hands trembling, spoke softly. "I trusted them, Jane. Louis, Alex, how could I be so blind?" Miss Marple smiled, her voice gentle. "You see the best in people, my dear, and that is no fault. But sometimes the best must be tempered with caution." She paused, her needles clicking softly. "The Institute will go on, with Gina and Walter to guide it. You've built something worth saving." As evening fell, Miss Marple retired to her room, her knitting a companion as she sat by the window, gazing at the dark expanse of the estate. The storm had passed, leaving a clear sky studded with stars. The scorched carpet, the burned letter, the garden shoe print, all had led her to the truth, a truth hidden behind a mirror's trick. She thought of Alex's theatrical flair, Louis's desperate control, Ernie's unwitting role. The murder had been a performance, but Miss Marple, with her village-bred instincts, had seen through the illusion, finding the truth in the smallest details, a mark, a glance, a confession. Chapter 12. The curtain falls. The 8th day at Stony Gates dawned with a fragile clarity, the storm's aftermath leaving the air crisp and the estate bathed in a soft, golden light. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm, the gentle click-clack blending with the distant chirp of birds reclaiming the grounds. The room, with its chipped porcelain ornaments and faded chintz curtains, felt quieter now, as if the house itself exhaled after the storm of revelations that had unmasked Louis Saracold and Alex Restorick as Christian Gulbranson's murderers. The scorched carpet, the burned letter fragment, the garden shoe print, the mirror's trick, all had led Miss Marple to the truth. And though the household was shaken, a sense of resolution lingered, delicate but tangible. Her pale blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, scanned the room, noting the subtle shifts in the household's demeanor as they faced the aftermath. The morning had begun with a subdued breakfast, the dining room's long table set with a modest spread of toast and tea. Carrie Louise, frail but resolute, had presided with a quiet dignity, her hands steady for the first time in days. Gina Hudd, her vibrancy tempered but returning, had spoken softly of plans to continue the Institute's work, her eyes bright with determination. Walter Hudd, his brooding silence softened, had nodded in support, his hand resting briefly on Gina's, a gesture of reconciliation that Miss Marple noted with quiet approval. Mildred Strata, her needlepoint resumed but her movements less severe, had offered a rare smile, her usual bitterness replaced by a grudging acceptance of the new order. The absence of Louis and Alex, now in custody, hung over the table, but the household seemed to draw strength from their exposure, as if a weight had been lifted. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, had observed the scene with a quiet satisfaction. The puzzle was complete, the threads of deception unraveled by the smallest clues. A scorch mark, a shoe print, a mirror's angle. Yet she knew the work was not done. The Institute, Carrie Louise's dream, faced an uncertain future, and the emotional scars of betrayal would linger. As breakfast ended, she had excused herself, claiming a need for air, and wandered to the conservatory, its glass walls gleaming in the morning light. The wilted ferns and damp earth were a reminder of Stony Gate's neglect, but also of its potential for renewal, much like the reform boys who toiled in the fields beyond. In the conservatory, Miss Marple paused to reflect, her knitting a companion as she sat by a cracked window. The murder, she thought, had been a performance of breathtaking audacity, staged with the precision of a theatrical production. Louis, driven by his obsessive devotion to the Institute, had used Alex's greed and theatrical skill to silence Christian's audit, which threatened to expose the embezzlement draining the estate. The blank shot, fired by Ernie Gregg under Alex's direction, had masked the real shot in the garden. The body moved to the study to create the illusion of a locked-room crime. The mirror's trick, the burned letter, the garden shoe print, all had been carefully orchestrated, but Miss Marple's village-bred instincts, honed by years of observing human nature's subtleties, had seen through the deception. Her thoughts were interrupted by Gina, who entered the conservatory, her face alight with a tentative hope. "Aunt Jane," she said, settling beside her, "I've been talking with Walter. We want to keep the Institute going for Grandmama's sake. It's what she's always believed in." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were resolute. Miss Marple smiled, her needles pausing briefly. "That's a fine thing, my dear," she said. "The boys need someone to believe in them, just as your grandmother does. You and Walter will do well, I think." Gina nodded, her fingers twisting a stray curl. "It won't be easy," she admitted. "Louis, he was everything to this place, but we'll find a way." Miss Marple's heart warmed at the young woman's resolve, seeing in her the strength to carry forward Carrie Louise's vision. As noon approached, Miss Marple ventured to the garden, her steps slow but purposeful across the damp lawn. The yew hedge, where the shoe print had been, was now softened by rain, its outline faded, but still a silent witness to the crime. She paused, her umbrella shielding her from a stray drizzle, and imagined the scene. Alex, under Louis's orders, firing the fatal shot in the garden's seclusion, Ernie's blank shot echoing in the study to mislead. The mirror's angle, the performance's chaos. It had been a masterful illusion, but no match for the quiet persistence of observation. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Fate, where a magician's sleight of hand had been undone by a child's sharp eyes, and saw the parallel here, the truth revealed by the smallest details. Returning to the house, Miss Marple found Stephen, the quiet reform boy, polishing tools in a shed. She engaged him with her disarming charm, asking about the Institute's future. Stephen, his hands steady on a wrench, spoke cautiously. "Ernie's been quiet since the arrest," he said, glancing toward the dormitory. "He thought he was clever, helping Mr. Restorick. Didn't know it had come to this." Miss Marple nodded, her heart quickening. Ernie's role, she thought, had been pivotal but unwitting, a pawn in Louis's game. "And you, Stephen?" she asked. "What will you do now?" Stephen's eyes met hers, a spark of hope in them. "Keep working, miss. Mrs. Saracold believes in us. I won't let her down." Miss Marple smiled, seeing in him the potential Carrie Louise had always championed. At lunch, the dining room was quieter, the tension eased by the truth's emergence. Gina, her voice steadier, spoke of hiring a new manager for the Institute, someone untainted by the past. Walter, his silence broken, offered practical suggestions, his gruff tone softened by a new-found purpose. Mildred, her needlepoint less aggressive, spoke of supporting Gina, her words tentative but sincere. Carrie Louise, her frailty tempered by resolve, listened with a quiet pride, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with gratitude. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, observed the shift, a family healing, rebuilding from the ashes of betrayal. After lunch, Miss Marple slipped into the drawing room, her eyes drawn to the fireplace mirror, now just a silent witness to the crime it had helped conceal. She tested its angle one last time, confirming how it had hidden movement during the performance's chaos. The scorched carpet, the burned letter, the garden shoe print. All had been clues to a staged murder, orchestrated by Louis to protect his institute, using Alex's greed as a tool. She thought of Ernie, whose cunning had been exploited, and Stephen, whose quiet strength promised a brighter future. The puzzle, she thought, was complete, its pieces fitting together with the clarity of truth. As evening approached, Miss Marple joined Carrie Louise in the library, the quiet room a haven from the house's lingering shadows. Carrie Louise, her hands steadier, spoke softly. "I was so blind, Jane," she said, her voice tinged with sorrow. "Louis, Alex, I trusted them, and they betrayed us." She paused, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. "How did you see it, when I couldn't?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly. "I watch, my dear, and I listen," she said. "In a village like mine, you learn that secrets hide in the smallest things, a glance, a pause, a mark on the floor. Here, it was the same, only the stage was larger. Carrie Louise nodded, tears in her eyes. You've saved us, Jane. The Institute, it can go on, thanks to you. Miss Marple patted her hand, her tone gentle. It will go on because of you, Carrie Louise, and Gina, and Walter. You've built something worth saving, and they'll carry it forward. As they spoke, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the future, to the boys like Stephen, who would find redemption in the Institute's work, and to Gina's resolve, which would guide them. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple prepared to leave Stonygates, her modest suitcase packed with her knitting and a few keepsakes from Carrie Louise. The train to St. Mary Mead awaited, and she stood on the platform at Market Kindle, her shawl neatly draped, gazing at the estate one last time. The red brick and pointed gables, weathered but enduring, seemed to stand taller in the sunlight, as if relieved of their secrets. Gina and Walter, arm in arm, waved from the drive, their faces bright with purpose. Mildred beside them offered a nod, her sternness softened. Carrie Louise, frail but smiling, raised a hand in farewell, her gratitude unspoken but clear. As the train pulled away, Miss Marple settled into her seat, her knitting resumed as the countryside rolled past. She thought of the mirror's trick, the blank shot, the burned letter, all the elements of a performance designed to deceive. Yet the truth, as always, had been in the details: the scorched carpet, the garden shoe print, Ernie's unwitting role. She recalled a village mystery where a hidden letter had revealed a thief, and saw the parallel here, the truth emerging through patience and observation. Mirrors, she mused, her needles clicking softly. Show us what we wish to see until the truth is revealed. And with that, she turned her thoughts to St. Mary Mead, ready to unravel the next puzzle that awaited her.